There are whispers that crawl through the marrow of families, secrets that are never written, but pressed into silence, like wax over a seal. And when the matriarch says, "We do not speak of the twins," she is not speaking from preference. She is commanding from fear, for she knows that some memories once spoken aloud do not remain memories at all. They awaken. They reshape the very house you stand in. They breathe into the cracks of the walls and shift the rhythm of your own blood. Imagine sitting at a dinner table where every portrait stares too long, where every name is repeated except two, and when you ask about them, you are told only that silence is safer. Silence is survival. And yet something in you wants to know, because you already sense that these twins are not gone. They are not forgotten. They are waiting. And the silence that buries them is not protection. It is containment. And you have just broken the first seal. The story begins not in the open air of memory, but in the locked corridors of a family estate where light never quite touches the corners. The twins were born under strange omens, their cries arriving at the very hour the village church bell cracked mid-toll. Some said it was coincidence, others said it was a curse. But within the family, the whispers began to spread that these children carried something more than blood, that they were marked not by chance, but by inheritance. The matriarch understood before anyone else that their very existence threatened the balance of power within the lineage, and so she decreed that their names should not be spoken aloud, and their faces should be hidden from photographs. It was not death that removed them from history. It was silence, deliberate and cruel, a silence sharp enough to slice through generations and bind every tongue that might dare to speak truth. And so the twins became shadows, not through loss, but through a ritual of forgetting. The silence around the twins was not emptiness. It was a command, a weapon crafted to control memory itself. The matriarch understood that words are chains that bind the living to the dead, and so she cut the chain at its root. The family gathered for meals. The children laughed in corridors, yet no one dared mention the twins. It was as if the house itself strained to erase them. Rooms they once occupied were locked doors, sealed with excuses that never made sense. The photographs in the hall carried strange absences, where spaces looked deliberately cropped, and journals written by family members contained whole blank pages. As if ink refused to tell their story, the twins were alive, in flesh, but murdered in memory, buried beneath the weight of obedience and fear. For when a family learns to kill its own history, it learns also to train every generation in silence, and the silence itself becomes a curse stronger than any name. Whispers told a different story. Whispers that slipped through cracks in the silence like smoke from a dying fire. The older cousins spoke of strange cries echoing in the night, and doors that opened, though no hand touched them. Servants once swore that they saw the twins standing at the end of long corridors, pale and watchful, as if waiting to be acknowledged. Yet when pressed for details, their voices would falter. Their eyes would fall, because the matriarch's command was heavier than truth itself. Those who disobeyed felt the sting of exile, cut off from inheritance and family, belonging, stripped of name and place. So even the strongest bowed their heads and sealed their mouths. In this way the twins became both present and absent, a forbidden shadow in every conversation, haunting laughter at every gathering. No matter how many years passed, the silence did not fade. It deepened like soil piled on an unmarked grave. It was during one storm, when lightning split the sky and the old house seemed to tremble, that I first felt the presence for myself. The hallways smelled of damp stone, and the candles flickered, though no wind had touched them. In the stillness, I heard it faint at first, then clear, The sound of two voices whispering in perfect unison, my name spoken with a softness that chilled my blood. I followed against reason, drawn as if invisible hands pulled me toward the locked east wing. The air grew heavy, the shadows longer, and every step felt like sinking deeper into a truth the family had buried. When I reached the door, my hand trembled on the brass handle. Cold as ice, I pressed my ear against the wood, and there it was, again. 2 breaths in harmony. 2 beings waiting. And I knew without opening the door that the twins were not gone. They had never left. They lingered within the very marrow of the house, watching, listening, waiting for someone to finally break the silence. The next morning, the matriarch sat at the long wooden table. Her hands clasped tightly, as if holding back a flood of words. She looked at me with those hollow eyes and whispered that I must never speak of what I heard in the east wing. Her voice cracked, yet carried an iron weight, as though 1,000 ancestors pressed down upon her tongue. But silence only made the air heavier. I noticed how the other family members avoided that side of the house, as if its very walls carried contagion. Children were hushed when they asked questions, and the servants made the sign of the cross each time they passed the locked door. Secrets this deep do not fade, they ferment. They twist into something darker, and I could see it in every wary glance, in every strained smile. The twins were the missing piece in a puzzle of madness and guilt that bound the bloodline tighter than chains. The matriarch wanted to protect the family name. But in her silence, she fed the shadows that moved unseen through every corner of that cursed estate. The storm came that night, without warning, a wall of wind and rain that slammed against the house like fists on a coffin lid. The candles flickered and went dark, plunging the halls into a blackness that felt alive. The family gathered in the great room trembling, not from cold, but from memory. For storms had always awakened something buried in their history. I heard the grandfather mutter a prayer in a language I did not recognize, and the youngest daughter clutched a doll so tight her knuckles turned white. Then came the sound from the east wing, a slow rhythmic knocking, not from outside, but from within the walls itself. The matriarch's face drained of all color, and she whispered one word. Twins. The air grew thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I followed the sound, drawn like a moth to a flame, and there, behind the old grandfather clock, I found a seam in the wall, a hidden door sealed with rusted iron and etched with symbols older than the nation. This was not just a secret room. This was a tomb, a memory. The family had buried alive. The iron door groaned, as if it had not been touched in generations, and when it gave way, the smell that poured out was not of death, but of something worse, a scent of damp earth and forgotten blood that clung to the lungs. I stepped inside, and the room seemed to breathe, the walls lined with cracked plaster, etched with crude drawings of children always in pairs, always bound together by threads of red wax. 2 small beds rested in the center, untouched by dust, as though someone had been tending them. Though no one should have entered for decades, above the beds hung portraits, painted in oils that had blackened with age. Yet the eyes still glimmered alive, as if watching and waiting. The matriarch entered behind me, her hand shaking as she pressed a candle forward, and whispered that they had tried to erase this chapter, but the house refused to forget. She said the twins were not merely children. They were vessels for something carried through blood, a pact struck long before her birth, and each generation demanded payment. It was why their names were never spoken aloud, because names had power. Names could call them back, and as the candlelight shuddered across the walls, I felt the room listening, as if the twins themselves leaned closer in the shadows, hungry for recognition. The matriarch's voice trembled, yet carried a strange authority, as she confessed that the pact was older than the land the family had settled upon. She said long ago, when famine gripped their ancestors and death circled the homestead, a man desperate to keep his bloodline alive entered into a bargain with a figure cloaked in black. Not a priest, not a neighbor, but something that walked between both worlds. It promised survival, but demanded that in every other generation, a set of twins would be born, and those twins would not be allowed to live as ordinary children. They were to be kept together, hidden from the world, raised only. Until their 12th year, then, the pact required silence. The family would bury their names, their faces, and their laughter, and all that remained would be whispers in the walls. The matriarch confessed that her grandmother had seen them once, seen the twins dancing in the candlelight, with eyes that shone too brightly, not like children, but like mirrors, reflecting something vast and ancient. When the time came, they were taken below the earth into chambers, carved by hands that no longer existed. She said, they were never buried, only kept waiting, and now the house groaned, because their 12th cycle had returned, and the pact had not yet been fulfilled. The walls of the house no longer felt like wood and stone, but like flesh and bone. The floors breathed. With every step, the windows pulsed faintly with light, as though veins carried something beneath the glass. The matriarch whispered that when the pact was neglected, the house itself would awaken to remind them of the promise made generations ago. It was not just a home. It was a vault, a prison, and a mouth hungry for what it was promised. She told me of nights when laughter of children echoed through the halls, though none lived there, of shadows that gathered in corners, taking the shapes of small figures with clasped hands and hollow eyes. The twins who were not spoken of were stirring. She said they were restless. Not because they were forgotten, but because their cycle demanded recognition. The family had broken silence. The vow had been delayed too long, and now the house was demanding payment. It began with small things, doors unlocking themselves at midnight, food rotting. Seconds after being placed on the table, fires that refused to stay lit. Then came the voices in the well chanting, words in a language no one claimed to know, and always the chant ended with the same phrase, "Bring them back, bring them back." The chanting grew louder each night, until it no longer belonged only to the well, but seeped into the walls of the house, into the bones of those who tried to sleep. Even in silence, the words thrummed in the chest like a second heartbeat. Bring them back. Bring them back. At first, the family thought it was memory, playing tricks on them. But then the voices began to change. They stopped addressing the bloodline in general, and instead called a single name, mine. I heard it whispered when I stood at the threshold of the cellar. I heard it hissed when the wind pressed against the shutters, and when I closed my eyes, I saw the outline of two small forms standing hand in hand, with faces blurred, yet their mouths moving in perfect unison. The matriarch's warning had not been to protect me from knowledge, but to delay the moment when the weight of that knowledge shifted onto my shoulders. The pact had chosen me not because I sought it, but because something deep in the family thread tied me to those who were buried, yet never gone. Every ritual, every silenced whisper, every locked drawer in that house had been crafted not to banish them, but to contain them. And now the containment was breaking. Their hunger was not for remembrance alone. It was for continuation, for flesh, for breath, for someone to finish what was left undone. The night the truth revealed itself began with the smell of earth, wet and heavy, like freshly opened graves creeping into every room, though no window was cracked and no door was ajar. I followed the trail into the parlor, where the portraits of ancestors watched with eyes that had not aged, And there, beneath the matriarch's chair, the floorboards shifted as if something pressed upward from the soil below. When I pried them loose, I found the chamber that no one had dared to uncover, a pit, carved deep, lined with stone, and inside 2 small caskets side by side, yet neither held the peace of the dead. Their lids were carved with symbols older than the family line markings that pulsed faintly as if alive when I touched one. The sound of breathing filled the chamber. Shallow, ragged, but unmistakably human. And then I understood the silence had never been about shame. It was about imprisonment. The twins had been bound, not only in wood and earth, but in words, rituals spoken to trap their essence between life and death. The family had fed them, not with food, but with secrecy. Each generation sealing the pact, by turning away, by pretending the twins had never existed, and in doing so, they kept the hunger alive. Now the seals were cracking, the pact fraying, and the breath I heard was not a memory. It was a summons calling for the one who had finally dared to lift the veil. The pact is never written in ink. It is written in silence, in the obedience of those who never asked questions, and in the fear that made every mouth close before truth could escape. When I uncovered the chamber, the silence shattered, and the pact turned its gaze toward me. I felt it in the marrow of my bones, a pressure that was not weight, but command. It whispered not in words, but in sensations. The chill of iron, shackles on wrists, the taste of salt on a wound, the blindness of being buried alive. The twins were not just children. They were vessels, chosen to carry the shame of the bloodline locked away, so the family could rise in power, wealth, and reputation, untainted by what they called the defect. Yet that word was a mask beneath. It was something far more dangerous, a knowledge they carried from birth, a knowledge no one else could touch, and because of it, they were sealed into the earth, like weapons hidden until needed, that I had heard their breath. The pact recognized me as the one marked to continue it. I could feel the pull like invisible hands binding me to their story, dragging me toward their unfinished fate. The matriarch's voice echoed through memory, though she was long dead. We do not speak of the twins, not because they are gone, but because once spoken they return, and the moment you allow their name to form on your tongue, they belong to you forever. The inheritance does not come in the form of gold or land. It comes as a shadow that slips beneath the skin and rewrites the rhythm of your blood. It is the knowledge the twins carried, knowledge they were never meant to speak aloud, but knowledge that burned in their silence, waiting for someone reckless enough to open the door once I crossed into their space. Reality shifted subtly but unmistakably. Clocks ticked without sound, mirrors reflected more than my body, candles refused to die, even without flame, and the air bent with a gravity that pressed against the skull. It was as if the house itself had been constructed, not as a dwelling, but as a vessel to contain what the family feared most. The curse was never a tale to scare children. It was an inheritance of control, of manipulation, of binding one generation to the next, like marionettes hung from strings of shame and secrecy. The matriarch understood this. She held the strings with trembling hands, her entire life. But even she knew one day, someone would slip the knots free, and the twins were the key. They were never hidden because of weakness. They were hidden because of strength, a strength that could turn blood into command, silence into chains, and truth into weapon now. As their breath lingered in my ears, I understood why the family had guarded them, why the matriarch's command had sounded more like a plea than an order once the inheritance is touched. It does not release you, it claims you. The first vision came like a storm breaking through the walls of my mind. It was not dream, and not memory, but something older, a script carved into bone long before I was born. I saw hands clasped in ritual blood, dripping into bowls, carved with symbols that pulsed as though alive. I saw the twins standing over circles of salt, their faces calm, their eyes black as night, whispering words that bent the air like Iroh, in bending under fire. And then I felt the demand. The inheritance did not allow witnesses. It required participants. It asked what price I was willing to pay for knowing what had been buried. It pushed visions into my skull, men in chains, women, silenced children hidden behind walls, while elders in shadow feasted on control power, not measured in wealth or armies, but in the obedience of bloodlines and the fear of secrets kept. And when I tried to resist, the pressure grew heavier. My chest tightened. My skin prickled with cold sweat. I was being tested. My loyalty weighed not by words, but by willingness to surrender a piece of myself, because that is what the inheritance consumes. It does not live in books or stories. It lives in sacrifice and silence. The matriarch had carried it her entire life. The twins had been its vessels, and now it sought me, dragging me into its theater of shadows, demanding that I choose to either close my eyes forever or see until my eyes bled. The air thickened until it felt like I was drowning without water, each breath scraping my lungs with the weight of centuries. The house groaned as if alive, beams stretching floors, bending halls, elongating into endless corridors. And I realized this was no mere building, but a construct, a labyrinth grown from memory itself. Every step I took echoed with voices that did not belong to me. Whispers of children whose names were erased, cries of women who had been silenced, laughter of men who fed on control. Until their bones turned to dust, the inheritance had reshaped the home into a living riddle, and I was its prisoner. Every doorway led to another version of the same room. Portraits stared with eyes that followed, and behind them, shadows shifted, waiting for weakness. The walls pulsed like veins carrying blood that was not mine, and when I pressed my hand to the wood, it was warm as flesh. The trial had begun, and it was not about escape, it was about surrender. The labyrinth wanted proof. It wanted to know whether I would cling to the illusion of freedom or bow to the pattern written long before me. I stumbled deeper, losing sense of time, my footsteps sinking into floors that rippled like water, until I came upon a mirror, cracked and trembling, and in it I did not see myself. I saw the twins standing side by side, their lips moving in unison, their voices entering my head. They whispered not to run, not to fight, but to accept, because the house was not trapping me. It was molding me, shaping me into the next vessel. And in that moment I understood that every wall was my blood, every hallway my fate. The twins stood at the threshold of my reflection, their faces pale, their eyes impossibly dark, as if holding the weight of every buried century. They spoke together in a voice that shook my marrow and made the mirror ripple like water. They told me the truth, that no one in the family dared speak aloud, that our birth was not a mistake. It was a covenant, a ritual sealed before they ever drew breath. The matriarch had offered them as vessels, not of her will, but of something older, something that fed on bloodline, silence, and obedience. Their existence had been the anchor the family needed to keep its power alive. But when they grew restless, when their laughter cut through the stillness, when their eyes began to see too much, they became dangerous. They could not be allowed to mature because to grow meant to awaken, and awakening meant the collapse of everything. Their presence was erased, their names torn from every record, their belongings burned, their room locked. but they had never left the house. Their essence lingered, woven into its very structure. Their silence was the fuel that kept the dynasty thriving, and I understood the horror that this was not a story of children murdered and forgotten. It was a story of sacrifice demanded and obeyed, generation after generation. And now the twins stared through the cracked glass, their mouths curving into a smile, both innocent and cruel. And they asked me the question that rattled my bones. Are you ready to take our place? Because the silence must never end. The silence was no longer a choice. It was a command, a force that pressed against my chest and throat, as if unseen hands were testing whether I was worthy to join the covenant. The matriarch's words echoed in the marrow of the house. We do not speak of the twins. And now I understood why to speak of them was to break the seal, to invite their hunger into the open. The family had not protected itself with secrecy. They had imprisoned the truth like a weapon wrapped in chains, waiting for the one foolish enough to touch it. And I had touched it. The air turned heavy, the wallpaper seemed to breathe, and the locked door at the end of the corridor trembled, as if something behind it was waiting for my consent. The twins stared through the mirror, their smiles sharper, their eyes pulling me closer to their void. They whispered, not with words, but with memory. Fragments of every generation that had obeyed this pact. Men who had bent their heads, women who had sealed their mouths, children who had been offered in silence, all of them staring through my own reflection, urging me to carry the burden further than they could. The question burned through my skull. Would I stay silent and inherit the curse? Or would I speak and let the house consume me? The matriarch's voice slithered once more into my ear, not as a warning, but as an order. Silence is power. Silence is survival. Silence is bloodline. And I felt my tongue grow heavy, my breath shallow, my own reflection shift, until it no longer looked like me, but like them. The twins smiling with my face, and I understood that the house had already chosen.